Hello, my dear friend. I'm so very glad you decided to pick up this book and read of this tale, for it is quite a marvelous tale, full of adventure. It might be scary at points. Sometimes you might think everything is going wrong. But let me assure you, all turns out for good. Because, well, it always does for those with true and brave hearts. It begins a long time ago, in a world very different to our own. There lived two young boys named Jonathan and Timo. Although they were brothers, Jonathan being about a year older than Timo, they were also good friends, and they both loved adventures. They lived with their mother in a small village at the foothills of the mountains. She looked after their farm, but was often unwell, and had once broken her foot in the fields. It had never fully healed, and she required much help from the two young brothers. If they worked hard, once a week they were allowed to leave the farm and go on an adventure. A small adventure might involve wading through the shallows of the valley streams looking for crayfish. A big adventure was when their uncle would visit from the neighboring village and take them hunting in the foothills of the mountains. They loved these adventures the most. Ever since their father had gone missing in the mountains over 3 years ago, they had spent a lot of time with their uncle. Jonathan and Timo would watch as he expertly tracked deer, wild boar and mountain goats, and he never missed with his humongous willow bow. The three would camp under the stars and hear stories of the trolls that lived in the mountains, and of the fairies that lived under them. "Are trolls and fairies really real?" asked Timo curiously. "Perhaps," replied his uncle, "but I've never seen them in my lifetime or in the life of my father. Just stories, I would imagine, told to keep little ones in bed at night. But the world is big and we are small." He finished, gazing up at the stars. Jonathan and Timo could lie out there forever. Their dreams on those nights would be full of adventure. Dreams of the fairies under the mountains, of the king's throne room, and its secret passageways. But I digress, for I have a tale to tell. This particular adventure began as all the brothers' adventures did. Breakfast. They quickly ate some bread their mother had baked the day before, covered in rich honey, fresh from the hives. After breakfast, they packed their bags, bringing along some bread, aged cheese, and some rock apples. Rock apples are not what they sound like, but they do keep forever. Lastly, Timo packed his emergency survival kit, which he brought on every adventure. Then, picking up their walking sticks, they said goodbye to their mother and walked out the door, hearts keen for adventure. Little did they know that this adventure would not be a small adventure, nor would it be a big adventure. No, this adventure would be a most adventurous adventure. Jonathan and Timo decided that they would hike up to the higher foothills of the mountains, where the hills met the forests, where the trees grew tall and strong, sometimes so thick you could barely walk through. It was in these places they would often hunt for deer with their uncle. Jonathan had seen a large stag a few days ago with a broken antler, and after describing its grandeur to Timo, they decided to see if they could find it again. After quite a hike, they came to part of the forest they had not been to before. It was full of big, strong oak trees, and they grew in dense, unorganized rows. They moved in and out of the trees, pretending they were their uncle, tracking and hunting deer and wild boar. Suddenly, something caught their eye. Leaning against a tree was a long, large bow. Next to it, a dark quiver filled with black arrows. They stood still, staring at the discovery. Jonathan stepped closer. "Don't touch it," whispered Timo as he looked around to see if the owner was nearby. Why would someone leave this here, just lying around? Jonathan asked. Someone's been up here hunting, and they must have left it behind. Or they're nearby and coming back, exclaimed Timo nervously. Just then, Timo noticed something else. Deer tracks, and fresh ones too. His worries lessened as the possibility of tracking a deer rose. Timo and Jonathan's eyes followed the tracks further into the trees, when suddenly, out from behind a tall fir, stepped a large stag with only one antler. There it is, whispered Jonathan, as he and Timo ducked behind a tree. It had not seen them. It's huge. Imagine if we brought it home for Mother. There was a glint in his eyes which did not go unnoticed by Timo. Don't do it, whispered Timo, watching as his brother eyed the bow and arrows. Just one shot, replied Jonathan. Then I'll put it back. Okay, good idea, said Timo, the excitement now overruling any doubts or thoughts of common sense. He handed his brother the bow. Jonathan fitted an arrow to the bowstring and crept from behind the tree. The large stag was standing unawares amongst a particularly thick portion of forest. Jonathan edged closer, his heart beating very fast. He paused behind a fallen tree, just 20 paces from the deer, pulled back as far as he could on the bowstring, took aim, adjusted for the distance as his uncle had taught him, pulled even harder and missed. The arrow did not make it halfway to the deer, for this was a great strong bow and Jonathan was only a child. Only a great hunter or something bigger could have used this bow. But it had done enough to scare the deer. It sprang away up the mountain with frightful pace. Timo and Jonathan ran after it, although the deer was much faster. It ran swiftly through the trees towards a large cliff at the base of the mountains. There before the cliff stood a large boulder, the size of a house, which the deer ducked behind for shelter. Timo and Jonathan, looking ahead while running, noticed it did not re-emerge from the other side. Jonathan and Timo paused their chase. It must be behind that rock, panted Timo, gazing forward at the large stone standing before the tall cliff at the base of the mountain. If I creep up on that side, he pointed to the left side of the rock, and you go that way, pointing to the right side, we'll have it trapped, and you can get another shot. They had quite forgotten about leaving the bow behind after just one shot. Good idea, whispered Jonathan, excited at the prospect of redeeming himself. He and Timo crept closer. They were quite close to the large boulder and kept their eyes peeled to make sure the deer did not emerge from either side, trying to escape their brilliant trap. They crept closer, hearts pounding even though they knew they weren't in any real danger. Deer are not dangerous. And they had quite forgotten about who might the bow belong to. Jonathan was now nearing the right side of the stone, and still the deer had not emerged from behind it. The large cliffs loomed up in front of him as he took out another arrow from the quiver. Fitting it to the bow, he nodded to Timo, who had now reached the left side of the boulder. Silently but quickly, he darted around the stone, but nothing was there. The deer was nowhere to be seen. Timo emerged from the other side of the rock, looking puzzled. I never saw it come out. Where did it go? Asked Timo, walking towards his brother. Jonathan, who had rushed around faster than his brother, was standing still, facing the cliff, and in front of him was a small opening in the rock face. Must have gone in there, he said. Looks too narrow, said Timo. Those antlers wouldn't have fit, but it must have gone somewhere. The opening was a sharp crack in the face of the cliff, just tall and wide enough for a small child to walk through. It had stood there for many years, hidden from view of possible onlookers by the large boulder. The brothers peered into the darkness. They could not see the deer. Let's check it out, said Jonathan, grinning, his adventurous spirit rising within him again. Maybe we'll find the deer. If it did go inside, it wouldn't have gone far. Timo doubted their chances of finding anything, but needed no convincing to continue an adventure. They took a few steps inside the cave. It was dark and cold, and feeling the walls, they noticed that they were damp and mossy. They ventured in around 30 paces before the dwindling light made it harder to find their way. Turning back, and a little disappointed they had to cut their exploration short, Timo laughed out loud. I completely forgot, he exclaimed. My emergency survival kit. Adventures big and small, one thing was for certain. Timo would be there and would never, ever forget his emergency survival kit. His emergency survival kit consisted of a water skin, flint and steel to make fires, a small box of tinder to catch a spark, some rolls of cloth dipped in sap from a fire tree, a bandage, some flour gum to chew on if he ran out of food, and a small knife. They left the cave, and Timo, finding a suitable stick, took out his emergency survival kit, wrapped the end of the stick in a sap-covered cloth, and handed it to Jonathan. Hold this, he said. He then pulled out some tinder and lit a small flame with the flint and steel. He held up the tinder to the cloth, and soon they had a well-made torch that could burn for hours. Their uncle would have been proud.